1:15, and so I resume the hearing. Before going to Mr. Good, who I suspect is going to take us on a little detour, slightly off the path we've been following so far. Two questions, and the first one sort of follows from a point that Mr. Bewley made earlier, and that is, has consideration been given to retaining from, well, that's not quite the right way to put it, but keeping within the plan H59 alone?
No, because they've been looked at together. And they've been advanced together.
So consideration has not been given to that. I wonder if it should be. I mean, they are separately proposed allocations, and we wonder whether or not the impact of H59 alone would lead us to the same conclusion that you invite us to reach on the whole package.
I think the short answer is, if you want to require that as a modification, there'll have to be a new HRA. Just so we can be sure. So can I park that to main mods? But certainly they've been looked at together because they've been advanced as a single. I know they're two different allocations, but that's why they've been considered together.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say on that, Mr. Bewley.
Well, simply this. It seems to us that the logic must be that if you are not satisfied, for the reasons you've just intimated, I appreciate that's exploring ideas, that H59 needs to go on the evidence you've seen, then you shouldn't recommend that deletion. Now, what then has to happen in terms of HRA, I pass, but if you're not satisfied with that, then you shouldn't recommend the deletion of H59, because it can only be appropriate to delete it if you're satisfied it would be inconsistent on the evidence of impact. I would certainly want to say you can't be. It's not my primary case. Obviously, my primary case, you keep the lot, but
yeah. In your view, Mr. Elvin, are we in a position to reach a conclusion about H59 alone on the basis of the HRA that we currently have?
No. And Natural England would need to be consulted on it as a standalone. And as much as I'd like to look for a pragmatic solution, which I've tried to do as often as possible, I do think we'd have to do a screening and an appropriate assessment if necessary to be absolutely sure. And as I say, we'd have to consult Natural England on it as a standalone. I mean, I'm not saying that it couldn't be. I'm just saying I'm not in a position to confirm that it can be on the existing material.
Yeah, we're wondering whether or not, to be honest, that puts us in a slightly sticky position, because they are. I can fully understand the reasons why they've been looked at together, and that makes logical sense. But nonetheless, they are separate allocations, and in effect, sort of separate parcels of land, and it's slightly worrying, because I suspect you're right, Mr. Elvin, that we probably can't reach a conclusion on H59 by itself on the basis of the current HRA. What needs to be done?
a separate HRA would need to be undertaken and Natural England consulted. What principle we'd be looking at, because there are obviously some dwellings there at the moment, is no net increase. Are you prodding me towards saying you would like us to have a look at the matter before phase 4? Yeah, I thought you were. Can I just check? I think we probably can. I'm not going to commit us to a timescale, but we'll examine that for you.
Yeah, I'm not going to push you for timescale either, because for a start, I'd rather that you spent the time necessary on the HRA, because I think we're talking about doing a separate HRA, aren't we, for H59. I'd rather that time was taken, it was done properly, and also I'm conscious that it would also involve consulting Natural England.
Out of our control.
And I think I'd be hard-pressed to put a timetable on that.
Yes. Yeah, we'll do what we can. Happy to look at that, though.
Okay, so just for the record then, if we add to the homework list the undertaking of an HRA in relation to H59 alone, and consulting Natural England. And then others, in due course.
We'll communicate through Carol when we know where we're going with it.
Grateful for that, thank you. And just the second then of the two questions, I don't know, Mr. Elvin, if you'll be in a position to answer this one or not, and if it's unfair, please do let me know. Yeah, we were interested to know if we were with Mr. Bewley on the issues that we've just been talking about, and we did not recommend the deletion of the 2 sites from the plan, would the council be likely to adopt the plan in that scenario?
You're right, I don't know the answer to that question. I think we'd be in a difficult position given Natural England's advice, and that had quite a significant effect in the Wyatt case. We'd need to think about it, I think, is the answer. I mean, obviously, it's your decision as to what is required to make the plan sound, but we'd have to consider that. I mean, it was the only reason for deleting ST35 and H59.
I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say on that, Mr. Bewley.
I don't think I can speculate about what the council will do. By definition, the only observation I suppose I would make is that in the nature of that situation, the council would have the benefit of your considered views on the point, and they'd be entitled to rely on them, and I'm sure they'd accept that. Doesn't mean they'd have to agree, but they'd have that situation. In that regard, they'd be in a materially different situation from the one they're now in. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll check, but I'd be surprised, given that it was allocated in the first place.
You'd be surprised if
we would hold your report up to Natural England and say, well, it's been duly considered.
So you think the likelihood is that the council probably would adopt this?
I should think so.
Thank you for that.
I don't think you need to see that as an in terrorem submission by me saying, well, if you go against what we've said, we might as well go home. I'm not saying that at all. As you know, we have tried long and hard to keep this plan on the rails.
and your efforts in that respect are appreciated. Mr. Good.
Thank you, sir. I will start by saying, obviously, whilst we're here for this session, we don't actively support the DIO in their proposals, but we do find ourselves with some similarities and some points of interest. You'll be aware of my client's interest, and I'll try and keep away from those, sir, because I recognise it's an emission site.
I know the temptation will be a strong one, Mr. Good, but if your strength can be equal to that, I'd be very grateful.
Indeed it will be strong, but I fear that I'm up to the task, sir. In terms of the commonality between us, the 400 metres was an issue which we raised, and we do find ourselves agreeing with Mr. Bewley about whether that should be done on a case-by-case basis. And in our opinion, yes, it should. It can't simply be a straight line distance in every case means that there is obvious access onto the common or any other SAC for that regard. And you'll find various features within and around Strengthel that may or may not make that more difficult, easier, etc. By way of reference as well, I had the fortunate pleasure of being at the Waverley local plan last week. I won't go into too much detail about that, sir. They too have a heathland called Wealden down there, and the council and Natural England in that case have come to a reasoned mitigation for sites within 400 metres of that, sir. Now, I haven't put those submissions in as I was only sat there last week and I didn't think it was appropriate to do so. But it's worth you being aware of that, sir. For us, however, the main implications of the removal of these two sites is what that does to the plan as a whole in terms of a settlement the size of Strengthel having no identified residential allocations. Obviously, there may be the odd windfall site, sir, but those are unlikely to meet the 500 plus, which was identified by the DIO through their two sites. Now, I'm not saying you need to fill a hole of 500 plus, and I won't go through the supply issues which we discussed earlier in the hearing, sir, but at submission, the council clearly thought those 500 homes or a sum around about that were required to make the plan sound. Now, I recognise for various reasons they've been removed after that, but it does seem to me that without any further allocations in Strengthel, it does leave that settlement in a slightly odd situation in terms of its scale and its size. And because of that, sir, and it's a point we made well over a year ago now when they did the revisions consultation after the phase 1 hearings. I can't exactly remember the initial date of that, sir, but as you're aware, it is a while ago. We did raise the fact as to why the council at that stage hadn't considered other sites that fell outside that 400-metre cordon. Specifically because of the issue with regards to the size of Strengthel, the lack of other allocations within that area, and the impacts thereon on the common. As I said, sir, I won't stray into my client sites, but you will see it within our hearing statements if you are interested in seeing what other alternatives there may be.
I have noted the alternatives.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Elvin.
Well, without a clearly defined site and without an HRA, it's impossible really to comment further.
Not wanting to prejudge what may happen with H59, sir. However, that would provide, if that process was gone through, an opportunity to look to see whether other reasonable sites were available.
So this will be entirely down to your views in due course on the OAN, the adequacy of the trajectory and all those other issues. And as I said to you at the time during phase 2, we'll review what your position is on that and make any necessary adjustments initially within existing allocations and then outside if necessary. But I'm not going to speculate until we know what your position is. So it may or may not be the case.
You'll be happy to leave that with us, Mr. Good.
I will, sir.
I just suppose I should explore gently the issue of if we took the point that was made about Strengthel as a settlement and it being perhaps a little unusual that it wasn't receiving any housing, if we took that view, any such housing in Strengthel would require a HRA immediately. I just wanted to be clear about
the proximity to the SAC would require, we did have to screen it at the very least.
That's helpful. I just wanted to be clear about that.
And if you think that the evidence that we've got to date is showing people travelling from the existing settlement 50% and many travelling from over 7.5 kilometres, we couldn't not do that.
Thank you.
Just quickly, sir, just through yourselves. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the 400 metres buffer. There are quite clearly sites within Strengthel that are more than 400 metres away. Would that still apply in those cases?
I think my understanding is I think it would. There'd still be a need for an HRA. And, well, at least a screening, consultation with Natural England and so on.
I suppose my only comeback to that, sir, and I don't want to prolong this, would be most HRAs have various distances, so up to 400 metres, then it's usually 400 metres to a few kilometres, etc., etc. Now, I'm aware that some other allocations within this plan, sir, haven't been through that process, but may well be within those kind of distances.
I'm afraid this is confusing two things. It's confusing the need to screen for an HRA with zones which are imposed by policy around a particular site. And where sites are permitted, there may be general policy restraints, as they are Thames Basin Heaths, the various authorities, and Dorset and Ashdown Forest in mid-Sussex, where development is presumed against within certain zones, 400 metres, and then some have additional zones. So it's got nothing to do with the HRA, it's how you then formulate policy. We will still have to screen given the distance.
Thank you. I'm happy to move on.
Excellent. Okay then, so as promised earlier, I'll take issues 5.3 and 5.4 together. That is, in the event of the deletion of either site or both, what's the intention in relation to the resulting Greenbelt Boundary? And are those boundaries reasonably derived?
Yes.
Thank you. The proposed Greenbelt boundary for Strengthel is described in Annex 4 of the Greenbelt Addendum, which is EXCYC 59F. And the assessment notes that the previous allocations, the two that we've just been discussing, have been removed and there are no further allocations in Strengthel. So that Greenbelt boundary is set out on page 268 of Annex 4. It is also set out in Appendix 1 to the Council's matter statement on this matter, along with the other boundary maps for ease of reference and seeing those together. So we would say a clear and defensible Greenbelt boundary has been defined in accordance with MPPF, applying the methodology set out, which is in accordance with MPPF. It is boundary 5, which is the boundary to the south of Strengthel, which is the one that is applicable here, and there are details in the annex of the description of that. In terms of the boundary, the proposed boundary follows defined features which are recognisable, many of which have been established for a significant period of time, therefore providing a degree of permanence. There are a range of factors that are considered there, including carriageways, property curtilage, hedges, trees, fence lines. It is noted that there are some where there are some small gaps, but quite often when we're defining, as we are unusually with York, the Greenbelt boundary for the first time, it won't be a complete section. The southern side is perhaps the more complex one, but it seems a pragmatic response to that. But they are only small gaps. I would also note that through discussions there is a proposed small amendment to the eastern boundary so that the cadet facility, which is in the northeastern corner, would be removed from the Greenbelt along that boundary, and a plan of that I think is being prepared at the moment.
Okay, yeah, that's the change that Mr. Elvin mentioned very early doors this morning, isn't it? Yeah. So as I understand it, that's not in any of the proposed main modifications that have been put forward so far, but that's one that you are now suggesting.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And that was to exclude the cadets facility from the Greenbelt.
I don't know, sir, if you have the plan to hand at all, if you'd like me to point out where that is.
I
If
don't.
it helps, I'm about to do so. It might save the trouble. But
Pardon?
I'm about to do so very shortly, but if it saves the trouble, but I mean, it may be better if Ms. Brown does it.
I think we're in agreement of what we're doing with it. It's
There's not a
fairly
dispute about it,
straightforward,
so...
It was just if you needed for clarity as to where we're talking about.
Okay, I just want to be clear that I'm looking at the right thing. Annex 6 to the hearing, Council's hearing statement in the appendix shows a red line. That red line is was the proposed Greenbelt boundary. It will be modified further from there. I've got that right.
Yeah. So if you can see, I've got a plan here that is actually the previous allocation. If you can see, there's an insetting section.
Yeah.
It's just to follow that straight down.
Okay. Oh yeah, I've got you.
Okay, that sounds reasonably straightforward, and we'll have a look at that in due course when we have the new plan in front of us, the new map.
Can I just just to press that a little further? Can I just so that I'm absolutely clear, because the colorations on the plan don't help. But the way I'm reading this is that the majority of ST35, the built-up, if I can put it like that, part of it would be outside the Greenbelt, but parts of it, playing fields and so on, would be in the Greenbelt. So there'd be a small gap between a small gap of Greenbelt between the part of ST35 that would be outside the Greenbelt and the other sort of built-up area below. It's hard to show you. That bit.
So the proposed Greenbelt boundary, which I think I gave the reference to previously, is around on that southern part of the barracks, would follow the built form. It steps back in some cases for boundaries. It's not as tight as it could be. You've then got the largely open playing fields and other sport and recreation uses up to the south, which extends to where the ST35 boundary had previously been proposed, which would be in the Greenbelt. You then, beyond that further south, have the residential development of Strengthel Park, which in the amendment would be retained in the Greenbelt.
As long as I'm clear about that. And one last question. H59, the original allocation, H59, that would go into the Greenbelt?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I've got that right.
I have a feeling we interrupted you. you're done. Okay. Do I take it, Mr. Bewley, that you had little or perhaps nothing to say about all of that?
That would be slightly overstating it, but I hope I can do it quite quickly. So there are two questions, 5.3 and 5.4. One is, what do we do about Greenbelt if the allocations are removed? And the other is, what do we do about it if the allocations remain? To see the ambit of the dispute, can I just refer you to our matter statement, our hearing statement, in particular page 15. And it's got some plans on it. It might be useful just to have it up. They're plans that are taken directly out of the council's documents, but you can see them side by side. So page 15 of that document. So at the bottom of the page is what the council was proposing until this morning, as we understood it, if the allocations are retained. And that's what appeared in the plan as originally submitted. Now we've now got the clarification that the kink, which is on the right-hand side, comes back out of the Greenbelt. That's the cadet facility. So if you look at the top of the page, that's what it should look like. That's our document, and that's what we're proposing. Do you have that?
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure what you meant by at the top of the page. I'm
So
looking
page
at,
15
I'm looking at paragraph 3.1.
3.1 of our matter statement. On the same page, so above question 5.4, there's another image. Do you have that?
I do.
I'm grateful. So that, in fact, which is identical to the image which appears over the page, we can happen to see it on this. That's what we're proposing. So if the allocations are retained, the council now having agreed about the cadet site, that we are in agreement. There is nothing between us. If, however, the allocations are deleted, then the council is proposing something different, and that appears on the previous page, page 14 of this matter statement at the top of the page. That's the boundary you've just been looking at with Ms. Brown.
A slight clarification there that the plan that you referred to on page 14 retains what I will refer to the legacy of the kink, because it doesn't have the bottom section, but that would still be within the boundary of the Greenbelt would mean that would not be in the Greenbelt. So that would be an amendment to the boundary.
So you're going to, just for my clarification, then you're going to amend in relation to the Reserve Force and Cadet Association building either way. Is that right? Okay, sorry, I hadn't understood that because that was, okay, fine, thank you. That's helpful to know. Now, so what you have then at the bottom, leaving aside the point about the kink, which we can forget about now because that's all agreed. What you have then, for example, at the bottom of page 15, is the Greenbelt boundary as proposed in the submitted plan. And that's the Greenbelt boundary which the council invites you to adopt if the allocations are retained. What they say about that in their hearing statement for today is as follows. It's paragraph 5.4.4. The previously proposed Greenbelt boundary around H59 follows clearly defined and recognisable features, including mature tree belt, woodland and the curtilage of properties. These features offer permanence and provide a clear distinction between built-up areas and open land. We agree. But we do not understand, if that is correct, why the council adopts a different approach if the allocation is deleted, because the position is the same. The question of where the Greenbelt boundary goes simply doesn't depend on whether the allocations are retained or not. It depends on looking at the character of the land in terms of the purposes of the Greenbelt purposes and so forth in the MPPF, and deciding whether it is or it is not Greenbelt. If the council reached the conclusion with which we, subject to the kink which has now been resolved, with which we agree, we do not understand how you get a different result just because the allocations are deleted. Because, in fact, what these boundaries are doing, I'm looking at the ones originally submitted, which we're inviting you to adopt, is that they simply follow the fence line of QEB. That's why, as the council rightly says, they follow clearly defined and recognisable features, etc. They do so because they follow the fence line of the QEB site. So the question for the council, which we suggest is simply not answered, first of all, is why do you get a different result at all just because the allocations are deleted? Answer, there can't be one in principle because it should be the same question that you're answering. Further, and in any event, if you go now please back to page 14 which, of our hearing statement, and I'm now concerned with where the boundary, because there's no actual dispute about where the boundary ends up if the allocations are retained, so the only dispute is whether they're deleted. You see it, as I've said, at the top of page 14, that's what the council is proposing if the allocations are deleted. Well, first of all, we're 99% sure about this, but I'm happy to be corrected. There's an area on that plan that's white, which is, as we understand it on this analysis, to go back into the green belt, even though it's not accepted by the site allocation. That's the Strengthel Park housing estate, which is a significantly built up area. It includes housing, existing housing, I mean. We struggle to understand why that is going back into the green belt just because you're deleting these site allocations and they're not part of the site allocations. That's a consistency point. It's not really a point I care about in itself, it's just a consistency point. But in any event, in relation to the area that we are concerned about, which is the QEB site, you now have a Greenbelt boundary which includes within the Greenbelt significantly built up areas. And we summarise it in paragraph 2.2 here. This is land that contains, spread out, but it contains buildings, roads, hard-standing, open storage on a significant scale. It contains an assault course, fixed plant, security fencing, formal landscaped areas. Oh, you can read it. It's all land that contains that kind of material. It's not part of the common, it's just part of the base. Now, it's true, it includes within it some green areas, playing fields and the like, but they're largely surrounded. For example, the playing fields in the south west corner of the QEB site are immediately adjacent to the housing estate that I've just drawn your attention to. So they're surrounded on all sides. And all of it is currently within the fence line of the base. Straightforwardly, therefore, just doing the analysis, applying the Greenbelt test which the council applies, which says it applies, to this land, it's not Greenbelt. It's built up land. And we develop those points in 2.2 to 2.8 of the hearing statement, which you can read. It's not open land, it's just not. And if it is, why have the council adopted a different approach if they retain the site allocations? It doesn't make any sense. Actually, they're right, subject to the kink, they're right in paragraph 5.4.4 of the hearing statement when they say, actually, I know this is only if we retain the site allocations, this is following a clearly defined, recognisable features of the land. We agree. Whereas, as Ms Brown acknowledged a moment ago, 5.3.5 of their hearing statement acknowledges that the alternative Greenbelt boundary, the one you get if you delete, isn't following clearly defined features of the land and so forth. Now, in 5.3.5, that's put in this way. This assessment acknowledges that there are very short stretches of linking boundary with no clear definition on the ground, but of course that's in the context of boundary 5 seen as a whole, which is a longer boundary than just this. In fact, the bits that aren't defined are the very bits we're arguing about. They haven't got a clear definition, and there is a very obvious clearly defined boundary, which is one the council is itself in a different context commending to you. So we say, follow 5.4.4 of their hearing statement. That's effectively our case. And it doesn't make a difference whether you retain the site allocations or not. That's it.
Okay, so there are three main points that I've picked up from there, and I'll respond to each of those in turn. In relation to the question around two boundaries, I think we're predominantly looking on the south side, but taking it as a whole as well around the barracks. Shall I continue, or do you want me to pause? We wish them well. I think it's very straightforward. In one instance, we're dealing with a proposed allocation, which is an area for development. In the other instance, we're dealing with defining a boundary without an allocation for development. I think it would be unreasonable to suggest you can't define greenbelt boundaries in different ways if you are dealing with those two scenarios. So I think it's not unreasonable to have two boundaries which are seen as meeting the requirements of MPPF in terms of being recognisable and permanent. Towards the end of the statement, it was suggested with reference to 5.3.5 of the matter statement, where we can affirm that the boundary is sound, but acknowledge there are very short stretches of linking boundary without clear definition on the ground. It was suggested that that is written in the context of boundary 5 as a whole. That is not correct. That statement is written in answer to your question, Sarah, of 5.3, which relates to this particular area. So I just want to get confirmation on that point. Moving on to the second point, which relates to Strengthel Park, which is the residential area to the south of the main barracks area. This is proposed at the moment for removal from the for inclusion within the Greenbelt. Rather, I'm
really sorry, I didn't catch that.
So, Strengthel Park is proposed for inclusion within the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt will wash over that area. It is, through the landscape assessment that's been carried out on that, it's recognised as very low density in a parkland setting, and thereby contributes to the openness of the Greenbelt, and even more so when seen in context of the playing fields, which are also proposed to be retained in the Greenbelt. And together and individually, they contribute to the openness of the Greenbelt. I think if you consider it as you might the washing over of small settlements, it could be seen in a similar line. I can move to the third point, but it looks like you're looking something. I can pause.
If you just bear with me one moment. So the Strengthel Park housing estate to the south, as I understand it, well, correct me if I've got this wrong, but in the submitted plan that isn't washed over, is it?
That's correct, it's inset.
So what's changed your mind about that?
My understanding is that was in the context of the allocation, so it would be adjoining that, which would also mean the playing fields were removed from the Greenbelt. So the combination of the two, of the playing fields and of the Strengthel Park and the openness that they provide, when it's when ST35 is not set as an allocation, they are then more isolated, which is where it's more comparable to the washing over of a small village or settlement.
So does the inclusion or otherwise of ST35 have any effect or bearing on what I think you described as the parkland setting of the Strengthel Park housing estate?
Yes, in so much as it would include the playing fields within the development allocation.
And might I add to that, of course, it would also prevent the loss of Strengthel Park and that parkland setting and the openness that that contributes.
I'm very sure that I interrupted you that time.
Thank you. So, referring to the third point from Mr. Burley related to the area, which I think is predominantly to the southern part of the barracks, which is the area that is where the Greenbelt boundary comes back from where it would have been on the allocation. He said that there are significantly built up areas which is contrary to our assessment, and as it sets out in our matter statement, that within this area it is largely open. It includes some sport recreation facilities which are appropriate development within the Greenbelt, and so it is an appropriate boundary to set with those areas maintained within the Greenbelt.
A few brief points. We don't know whether, and it would be helpful if the council could clarify whether, and if so when, they surveyed the site, because the last point that was just made was that their assessment of the site, of that part of the site, is that it has an open character. But we don't understand that to have been based on any physical presence of the site. It's just based on Google Maps. If that's wrong, then please tell us.
I last visited the site from publicly accessible places in June.
From publicly accessible places, so not within the fence line of the site?
That is correct, yes.
Right, so you haven't been within the fence line of the site?
No, I've been to the publicly accessible places.
And
prior to that, it's had a number of reviews, including from the council's appointed landscape assessor who did that in, I think it was June 2021.
Has anyone been within the fence line of the site?
I don't know where he accessed points from that. I'd have to refer to colleagues for that.
I mean, the simple point is that if you go onto the site, you will see, as we say in paragraph 2.2, hard-standing roads, buildings, etc. Now, there's space in between them. It's not as built up as some parts of the site, but they are interspersed. That's not, on the face of it, Greenbelt land. At any rate, the consistency point is that you go back and because this is an analysis that the exercise that the examination is engaged in is as follows. It's not of deciding whether to take something out of the Greenbelt that's definitely in, and it's not of taking something into the Greenbelt that's definitely out. You need exceptional circumstances and so forth. It's a question of defining more precisely the Greenbelt boundaries in circumstances where the current plan simply has indicative areas. So the exercise one has to do is to look at what is there now, not at what is proposed, but at what is there now, and decide whether it does or doesn't have the characteristics of Greenbelt. That is a question which should produce the same answer regardless of the future intentions of the site. It has to. And therefore, the exercise ought to be the same in both cases. Now, the conclusion that the council reached the first time around is, I've encapsulated it by reference to 5.4.4 of their hearing statement. It's the correct answer. We agree it's the correct answer, and they agree it's the correct answer, at least in one context. If they're going to take a different view because the sites are deleted, they have to explain what the difference is. By reference to something, and in principle I'd say that's impossible, because it's got to be by reference to something other than the future planning intentions for the site. That's the simple point. So that's yeah. It's by reference to the purposes of including land in the Greenbelt, not by reference to the future intentions of the site and whether you've got a housing allocation there. So that's a different kind of issue. That's it.
As a brief aside, Mr. Breedy, I think that you are saying that one needs to go within the fence line in order to appreciate the degree to which the land there does or does not serve Greenbelt purposes. I'm assuming that you'll let us go within the fence line.
We certainly would. Well, I think I probably ought to ask. But
I assume that we need to put some arrangements in place so that we don't get arrested by military police or something of the kind. Yes,
that would be regrettable, we think.
Well, amusing you might think, but perhaps regrettable.
I think my regret would outweigh my amusement.
We don't have to arrange for you to visit the MOD's main firing test range, which I had to do as an inquiry for them a couple of years ago, which was more interesting.
We don't insist on that.
I feel I've got two very boring points in response to that now. I think it would be helpful to visit the site. I think Mr. Burley listed a number of features that are on there at the moment. Most of them are appropriate development in the Greenbelt, but you can take a view for yourselves as to whether you think that constitutes Greenbelt appropriately. The second point you made, I think, is a repetition of what was said previously. So just one point of clarification only on that. He keeps referring to the section in 5.4.4 where we and how that answers the question. I think it's very important to understand what question that is answering, which is your question 5.4, rather than the one it was being suggested, which is about appropriateness of that in its own right as the only Greenbelt boundary. Thank you.
Can I just mention a practical point? Effectively, this same issue arises again for infal barracks. So it would be presumed, and it may well be that the same conclusion will be reached, it'd be sensible to have a visit, in which case it may be sensible to make those arrangements together, but that's a purely pragmatic point. I think, is that being heard next week?
I suspect we'll arrange a military site visit days, which hopefully some Land Rovers or something of the kind will be laid on for us.
I think all that's left then is to deal with 5.5, 5.6, 5.7. I mean, to a large extent, these questions are a rehash of what we talked about yesterday in relation to the other H sites, the non-strategic housing sites. On the basis that H59 remains in the plan, let me get that right. So if we take the view that it can remain in the plan, leave aside all the other discussion that we've had, I understand all that. But the point that we were asking about yesterday was about whether general DC policies were sufficient, and the answer we got consistently yesterday was yes, they were, and I'm presuming the answer would be the same here. We can deal with it as quickly as that, I think.
Yes, sir.
Good. And clearly, in the event that it remains in the plan, it's deliverable. We don't have to worry ourselves about that. And there aren't any site-specific issues. It's just essentially going over what we went over yesterday in relation to the others, but just to be clear.
Correct, sir.
Excellent.
Policy GI2A, the relevant DM policy here.
Yeah. Good. I'm content with that. Is there anything else we have to deal with today? That's been most helpful. Thank you.
Okay, can I have a Mr. Bewley type? I've just thought of something else. No. This was just in relation to the point I was making about screening for H59. Just to remind you, one of the proposed modifications is a general strength and common policy, which is G12A, I think, 19A, sorry. Yeah. Which would require that as well.
There were some issues around that policy, but I think we can leave them to when we deal with the Green Infrastructure Group in the next phase of hearings. I'm quite happy to relate back to what we've discussed today, because there is some crossover, isn't there?
Yeah, that's our understanding, that it can be dealt with at a separate hearing, but obviously some of what said won't need to be done, the detail won't need to be done again.
Good, that was a useful reminder though, just to make sure it's on the MIQs. Is there anything else we have to deal with today? In which case, thank you.
Thank you.
The hearing is adjourned, and I think you're all resuming, or most of you are resuming next Monday. Is that right?
Have a nice holiday.
Sorry?
Have a nice holiday. All right.
Well,
all right. Crowd control.
Yeah, I'm not actually, just to be clear, I'm not actually going on holiday next week, but I'm preparing for one a few weeks later, which takes quite a lot of logistical expertise. So I can't be here, unfortunately. I've commitments. Good.
And the good news is Paul Tucker can do the 12th. That's been confirmed today, so that sorts out other commitments as well.
Yeah, we just need to ask Carol to make sure that everybody else who was attending that day with the intention of joining the debate can also make it.
Okay. Thank you.